Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's an especially good moment, I think, for this topic with so many trade war happening, tremendous tension between U.S. and China, especially around technology. And Matthew, I want to start with you. One of the conventional views about U.S. companies coming to China is that they encounter a lot of obstacles. It's very difficult. You're forced into joint ventures. The market isn't really open. There are concerns about IP protection and theft and so forth. So I wonder, in your experience in China, is that what you've encountered, or has it been a different dynamic than that?
At Cloudflare, our mission is to help build a better internet. And what we mean by that is how can we make the internet faster, more secure, more reliable, and more efficient. And those are universal values, whether you're in China or the United States or Europe. Those are things that you want. And so we were really surprised how many customers inside mainland China signed up for Cloudflare before we were even present there. And I think it's important to acknowledge that China is a very unique market, and it's a very different market, but it is a market where I think we were surprised how, if we worked with great partners, and if we were respectful to the local laws and culture and market, that it was actually possible for us to really thrive in China. And it's been a really positive experience for us.
And do you have any concerns around the security of your networks, the security of your information, or is that not an issue that's come up?
You know, we were fortunate enough to be able to really choose who our partner was, and back in 2013, we chose to partner with Baidu to really take on the small and medium-sized business market inside China. And from the beginning, you know, I think a lot of people who were advisors to us said, oh, you've got to worry about your intellectual property being stolen, you've got to worry about things being copied. But the challenge was that when you're going into a partnership, if the very first thing that you say to a partner is, I don't trust you, it makes it really hard for you actually to build a real partnership. And so I think we were in a fortunate place where the value of Cloudflare was really the global network that we had created. And any individual line of code, we weren't so worried about sharing. And so I remember when we announced the partnership, someone said, well, are you worried now the Chinese government has all your source code? And I said, well, it would have been easy for them to get it before. We published it all on GitHub. And so I think that was a big piece that made it easier for us to do that. And I think that openness and creating a real partnership is a key, not just in China, but anywhere that you're going to do business in the world.
So, John, when you've had companies, portfolio companies, say that that are U.S. companies or Western companies that you're trying to bring to China, have they run into any of these kinds of problems, or are there things in the Chinese system that are more restrictive or more difficult than they should be?
Well, if there's any problem, it's not being put upon us. We invested in WeWork. This is a U.S. company, high flyer. And they choose us to be a leading investor, explicitly wanted it to be in China. And we decided that the best way to do WeWork China is to establish WeWork China as a subsidiary. So all of that is because, as Matthew said, China is a unique, attractive market. True to a good business, you want to be close to customer. You want to be conforming all the legal requirements locally, and we thought the best way is to form a local joint venture to attract local funding partners, local operating partners, and so far it's been great. So there's nothing that is being forced upon, and there's a partnership approach to actually enlarge WeWork itself.
So that wasn't the joint venture wasn't a requirement? That wasn't forced on you?
No, not at all. Not in this instance. There are certain industry where there's, for instance, just before now, if you wanted to make cars, you need to find a local partner. But again, each country in different stages have that. The U.S. has National Security Review, right? CFIUS. So there are some, country-specific requirement. And China, because it's such a large market, is attracting all kind of attention. China is very unique. So I think there's a lot of issues to be worked out, and that comes with the territory.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not unique just to China. You think of if you're a business trying to sell into a market like Japan and you're a foreign business, doing that on your own is incredibly hard. Whereas if you have a partner like a great Chinese investor or one of the other sort of Chinese internet companies, that helps guide you through what that unique market is. And there are unique characteristics of all markets. And so I think while there are things that are different about China, there are things that are really different about a lot of places around the world.
Well, is there any validity to the idea that the Chinese market is too closed, too restrictive, and doesn't have sufficient protections around intellectual property? I mean, if we set aside the trade war for a moment and just consider that on its merits, I mean, is that a legitimate set of concerns?
Well, I think so, especially today. China has developed into a very sizable economy. China now is upgrading its model from basic development to more advanced development, talking about innovation and technology development. So some of these intellectual property issues are coming up. But I remember 30 years ago, China is wide open. Whoever wanted to come in investing, China would actually give foreign investors such a favorable terms. You don't have to pay tax for 3 years. You know, you're giving free lands. You're giving a lot of things that local Chinese companies would never dream of being getting. And then, of course, when you get to the next stage, the playing field is levered. They treat every company the same. No tax break for foreigners anymore. Now a competition. Then I think a lot of foreign investors, foreign companies feel, well, you know, maybe there's some restriction there. Those are what I call the issues, is to be resolved. For instance, intellectual property rights protection. I think China has gotten to the point where they needed to better their protection law and practice just for the sake of their own development. It doesn't have to be pressured by foreign power or foreign company. China has the most graduates on earth, largest consumption market, most startup companies. If we don't get intellectual property respected and protected, we're not going to be able to develop that. So it's going to come.
You know, I was on a Aspen Institute panel with a whole bunch of U.S. government officials, and they all said, you know, we're falling behind China in terms of AI, and we need to look at the fact that China has filed 10 times more patents in intellectual property or in artificial intelligence than relevant companies have in the United States, and this creates this whole threat. And I looked up and I said, I think you missed the critical factor there, which is China's filing patents. And the fact that you're starting to get a developed intellectual property protection system there, I think means that it becomes easier to, if you're an innovator, either a Chinese innovator or a U.S. innovator or a European innovator, that those systems and those protections are starting to develop. And I think that's actually a really encouraging trend for the country and for the region.
So to shift to the other side of the equation, you mentioned CFIUS. Is that obviously the U.S. is becoming more scrutinizing more heavily, let's say, foreign investment in the U.S., especially in sensitive technology sectors. So is that something that you've run into or started to run into, this kind of tougher scrutiny of such investment?
Well, if you read from the press or listen to politicians' rhetoric, it feels that way. We've always invested in the U.S., just like we brought U.S. company to China. So far, you follow the rule, and even CFIUS process, we thought was a process you go through. We haven't run into what we thought was unfair, but there's a lot of more and more rhetoric that is concerning. So I hope people deal with matter of fact, and according to law and regulation, don't make a political issue out of that.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything that, that is legitimately of concern? So, for example, there's a lot of state-owned companies that have investment funds that are buying startups, investing in Silicon Valley, and as a U.S. citizen, you might look at that and say, well, it's the Chinese government is kind of taking over these U.S. technology companies. Is that something that should be a concern? In other words, should there be a distinction between private investors and state-backed investors?
Well, China is different from that of U.S. History, system, and status. So I think to make a simple conclusion that if the state-owned, it means bad. If it is privately held, it means good, is too much of a U.S.-centric view, because that's where U.S. success experience is. China have not had that experience. We have not experienced, the vibrant private sector supporting this and that. State-owned company is part of Chinese life. It's migrating to more and more market-driven. And we're right in the middle of this. Hony Capital make a point of restructuring and privatize some of the companies where it should. So I think it will take some time. And I think if I were to look at this, I want to look at the net effect and result versus labeling, who you are and predetermining if that's good for me or not.
Mm-hmm. And I think, In-Q-Tel is the venture capital arm of the CIA. So there's drawing real distinct lines here is tough. One of the things that I really admire about China is how the country really takes a long-term view, and it's sort of this tension between two things. When I meet with entrepreneurs or investors or partners there, it's always how can we go faster, but also at the same time taking this very long-term view. And I think that, there are challenges today, but 25% of all internet users are in China. China is going to be a piece of any successful long-term business strategy. And while there's a lot of tension around the current political environment, that long-term view is something that I spent the first half of this week in Beijing, and I'm surprised at how there really isn't slowing down, and people are still moving forward with an enormous amount of enthusiasm and want to create real partnerships that are going to last and survive and thrive over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way in which, obviously the Chinese market is gigantic, growing very fast, presents a lot of opportunities, but is very different, as you say. And so when Chinese companies that have done very well in China, if they want to expand overseas, is it kind of difficult in a way because the Chinese market is so different? So what are the challenges? Government and politics aside, what are some of the challenges that Chinese companies face in coming to Silicon Valley or to other countries?
Well, on the principal level, the growing Chinese companies that have gotten to a certain level because the domestic market wanted to expand internationally, the issues and opportunities they're facing are identical to those of U.S. companies 30 years ago wanting to come to China. Mm-hmm. So many of them will choose to find a U.S. partner or acquire a U.S. local company to become international. So that's why sometimes I'm feeling very puzzled why all of a sudden finding a local partner to access the market is such a bad thing. There are issues like intellectual property protection, but again, a lot of these issues can be worked out by continuing to work together to get a rule-based system that mutually understood and respect. Trade war is not exactly the most constructive way of resolving a dispute.
And I think that I think it would be in all of our interests for more Chinese companies to serve an international audience. I think that that's the more that there's trade going in both directions, not just in goods, but in services and ideas and culture, I think the better it is for the entire world. I'm really inspired by, for example, the story of Musical.ly, which was a Chinese-based startup that caught fire among 15-year-old girls in California and built an enormous following for that. I think we need more of that. And again, I think the more that we can cross-pollinate the culture between the China and the rest of the world, the better it is. I think that if you you can look at successful examples of companies that have really expanded. I mean, Huawei started with China and then took a model which was we're going to go to the developing world first, and then Eastern Europe, and then Western Europe, and the U.S. last. I actually think that's a real disservice to the United States if we're cutting ourselves off from real technical innovation, especially when it's just largely masked xenophobia and protectionism. I mean that doesn't serve anyone's interest. I welcome competition from Chinese companies, and I hope that it becomes easier for Chinese companies to come to the U.S. and I hope that the optimistic case of the trade war right now is that hopefully it will be easier for U.S. technology companies to come to China.
Do you expect to see big Chinese tech companies succeed globally? You cited a couple of examples, Huawei certainly, but there aren't that many examples. And companies, the big stars of the moment, Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, they don't really have a lot of international business. Do you expect that to change?
I mean, you can't travel through an international airport outside the United States and not see ads for Alibaba Cloud. I mean, they are a major force in that. I think it's going to be hard in North America and Western Europe in the short term, but over the long term, the best innovation wins, and I think that competition is really great. So. Yeah.
John, where do you think we might see Chinese companies being especially successful internationally? Which sectors do you think are most promising?
Yeah, I was going to say the answer to your earlier question is definitely yes. While Huawei or Alibaba is catching all the headline, the real force sits in rooms like this, where you have people, startup, entrepreneur, capitalists that are looking this holistically, globally. China has a huge advantage: market, talent pool, data science, biotechnology. So that's started to show. U.S. continue to have this strength in accumulative, innovation result. These things, when combined in a complementary way, create value for everybody. I don't see how that could be stopped. And while politicians need to sort out all the dispute, people sitting in this room and exchange like this will push it forward. So I do see Chinese companies, just like U.S. companies, will be more and more global.
In any specific sector?
Anything that relates to consumer experiences, consumer products, especially in the area of contents, data-driven, I think you could expect to see a lot of Chinese companies that are global.
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing that at Cloudflare, that we see every day Chinese companies that want to address a global market say, we want to sign up for your service because you can help us do it. And I think that's good for the world in general.
So you could look at it, we're about out of time, you could look at the trade war and all the tension and say, well, the dream of the global internet is over, the idea, kind of foundational ideology of the tech business, that it's global business, talent rises to the top, global internet. But you're both still a believer in that, despite the tensions we see at the moment?
Absolutely. I see the rise of globalization 2.0, which is internet powered and the new generation people-driven.
We'll go through short cycles and the political trends, but I think if you take the sort of long-term, very Chinese view, we are on a rise, and I think that this is a very appropriate name for a conference that's hosted here in Hong Kong.
All right, very good.
Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Matthew, good. Yeah.